Hey YouTube, Ed here with Jack of all trades and welcome to another video. So today what we're going to talk about is the very famous and iconic and sometimes very controversial Remington 700. So let's get right into the video. And welcome back. So yes, today we're going to talk about the Remington 700. This is an extremely iconic and popular rifle. Just about everybody has heard or knows of the Remington 700. And there are quite literally books written about this rifle and discussing this rifle, and rightfully so. That being said, it is very difficult to condense all of everything about the Remington 700 and its history down into one 15 or 20-minute YouTube video, but I'm going to try my best here. So back in World War I, both Winchester and Remington had contracts with the US military to produce a modified British pattern 14 Enfield rifle, also known as the M1917 or the American Enfield rifle. Remington produced hundreds of thousands of these rifles out of their Ilion, New York, and their Eddystone, Pennsylvania factories. And on November 11th in 1918, World War I thankfully ended. And as a result of that, in 1919, February of 1919, Remington stopped producing the M1917 rifle for the military, basically because they lost the contract. The contracts were canceled. The war was over. Now, Remington at this point in time is basically stuck with all the machines, all the tooling, and all the personnel and qualified and trained people to build these rifles, but they don't have any work. Now, you have to remember that at the time, lever action rifles were pretty much dominating the sporting firearm industry, but Remington decided they were going to start producing bolt action rifles, understanding that a lot of the American soldiers, the doughboys, were coming home from war and they were very used to operating, shooting, and handling bolt action rifles. And the thought was that bolt action rifles would become very popular in the sporting side of the industry. And lo and behold, Remington was right. So Remington started to produce what they called the Model 30. They started that in 1921. It was chambered in several Remington cartridges, like 25 Remington, 30 Remington, 32 Remington, 35 Remington, and of course the iconic 30-06 Springfield. The Model 30 Remington rifle was basically, for lack of a better term, a sporterized or stripped down Model 1917. Remington cut away a lot of the excess wood. They reduced the magazine capacity from 6 to 5. They streamlined and slimmed the rifle down and basically turned the M1917 into a hunting rifle. Now, in 1936, Remington's biggest competitor, which was the Winchester Company, also came out with a bolt-action rifle. And everybody knows the Model 70. That will be a future video, by the way. Now, remember, Winchester also had the contract with the military to produce the M1917 rifle. So they did much what Remington did. They redesigned the M1917. They got rid of a lot of dead weight and a lot of things that were holding the 1917 back from its true potential. And they came up with the Model 70. Now, Remington, knowing that if they were going to remain competitive with Winchester, they had to come up with something better than the Model 30 rifle to compete with the Model 70, because they quickly realized that the Model 70 was a very fine rifle and that the Model 30 just simply wasn't going to be able to keep up with it. So Remington basically went back to the drawing board and started redesigning and coming up with improvements for the Model 30. But unfortunately, World War II broke out, and pretty much all development on commercial sporting firearms pretty much ground to a halt in an effort to support the war over in Europe. However, one very intrepid employee of the Remington Company named Merle, or Mike, as most people called him, Walker, continued to work towards improving the Model 30 design. Mike Walker was an engineer. He was a competitive bench rest shooter, and of course, he worked for the Remington Company. He is credited with coming up or developing several cartridges for Remington, like the 222 and the 224. And he was also very instrumental in developing the button-pulled rifling process. So during the war, Mike Walker continued his tinkering and redesigning of the Model 30. And then when World War II finally ended, Remington very quickly introduced the Model 721 and its short action brother, the 722, based on the design inspirations of Mike Walker's work. The 721 and the 722 were both very fine rifles in their own right, but of course, there was obviously some room for improvement. And then in 1962, Remington came out with what we now today know as the Remington Model 700 rifle. Now, the Model 700 retained Mike Walker's trigger design, which we will talk about later, but it also incorporated several other design changes. And those changes were focusing on things like accuracy, simplicity, ease of manufacturing, and overall strength and robustness of the rifle. So the receiver on the 721 and the Model 700 were basically a round cylinder, i.e., they could be turned on a lathe. That means that they weren't forged out of castings and later machined and milled into shape. They could be completely manufactured on a lathe for the most part. And what that did was it really dramatically simplified the manufacturing process. And not only did it simplify it, it made the process much, much more accurate because they were able to keep the bolt face and the receiver or the breech face square to one another. And those were things that are paramount to good accuracy of a rifle. Speaking of the bolt, Remington uses a two lug bolt system, and those two lugs are 90 degrees from each other. And that bolt was also very, very easy to manufacture, and it was very easy to manufacture accurately. Now that design of this kind of a receiver also brought forward Remington's marketing campaign called the Three Rings of Steel. The Three Rings of Steel is encompassing three parts of the gun that were basically stacked rings uh, to address the stout and the strength and the robustness of the receiver. Those three rings included, one was the bolt. The bolt head actually completely encompasses the entire base of the shell casing, giving it a complete support and complete enclosure of the shell casing at the head. The second ring would be the breech face, where the barrel actually screws into the receiver, and that was very overbuilt and very stout and very robust. And then the third ring would be the receiver itself. So you had all three of those rings working together, and they completely encapsulated the shell casing. The gun was very overbuilt. It was very strong and very stout, as were most guns of that time. But marketing's Three Rings of Steel, or Remington's Three Rings of Steel marketing campaign was actually a bit of genius on their part to advertise the strength and the robustness of this rifle when they brought it to market. Now, this design simplicity of the Remington 700 also meant that Remington could manufacture the Model 700 just a little bit cheaper than Winchester could manufacture the Model 70. In turn, they could also sell the rifle just a little bit cheaper than the Winchester Model 70, therefore appealing to a wider array and broader range of consumers. Now, this rifle that I have here is a Remington 700. It's a newer version. It's called a CDL Classic Deluxe. This rifle was actually produced in 2015, and it's a very fine example of a classic Remington 700. It's chambered in 30-06, an iconic deer hunting cartridge in and of its own right. It's fitted with a really beautiful walnut stock. It's got a 24-inch field grade barrel. It wears a Nikon 3-9 by 40 Pro Staff scope on top, and it really just represents a typical setup that you would find in a Remington 700 that was used as a hunting rifle in North America and pretty much anywhere in the world for that matter. So now this rifle just represents one of the variations that the Remington 700 has seen over the course of the years. But it all started when Remington introduced the 700 with two basic models, the ADL and the BDL. The ADL, which was more of a meat and potatoes, a much simpler design, less fancy. It had a blind magazine on it. There just wasn't a whole lot of frills to that rifle. It was kind of more the working man's rifle, if you will. Whereas the BDL version was a much finer and fancier version. It had much higher grade of finishing on it. It was much more polished. It had things like the black fore-end nose cap on it, and it also had black cap on the pistol grip. They oftentimes had white line spacers in them to fancy them up. The checkering was much cleaner. It was just a much nicer rifle altogether as far as fit, finish, and appearance was concerned. And those were the two basic rifles that Remington started the 700 line off with. Now, understand that regardless of what variant of Remington 700 that you purchased, the Remington 700 was renowned for being very, very accurate. And this is largely due to the fact that it is very simple in its design. It is much easier to design or to produce an accurate rifle if it's easy to build. Less is more when you're talking about gun accuracy. That is why the 700 is often associated with precision rifle shooting disciplines and bench rest shooting disciplines. And it actually has found a very, very true niche home in the military and law enforcement under the sniping applications. It is just really renowned to be an accurate rifle, and it has drawn quite a lot of attention to itself in those various spaces. I would like to take a minute at this time to just go ahead and say that if you're liking these kind of videos and you like what I'm doing out here, please take a minute and go down and hit that like and subscribe button down below and ring that notification bell so you get notified of upcoming videos. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it really does do wondrous things to help support this channel, and it allows me to bring you more videos like this. And if you like them, let me know in those comments, and I will certainly continue to try to do more of them. Now, if you've watched my channel long enough, you've often heard me utter the words that nothing is ever perfect, and the Remington 700 certainly doesn't fall outside of that category. Uh, One of those things is the trigger. Now, understand the trigger is largely what makes this rifle as accurate as it is. The trigger is renowned for having a really good, crisp, clean break, just a very imperceptible touch of the trigger, and the rifle would go off, and it really contributed heavily to the accuracy. But that same trigger mechanism was also surrounded in a lot of criticism, and there was a lot of controversy over it. Several lawsuits and claims that the Remington 700 would just inadvertently fire all on its own without the user or the shooter depressing the trigger. Got a Remington into a little bit of hot water, and it got him into a little bit of controversy for quite a few years. Then in 2010, CNBC produced a 44-minute video surrounding the trigger mechanism of the Remington 700. And the claims were is that debris and improper care and maintenance of that trigger could physically impede the working mechanism of the trigger, and that would cause the rifle to go off without the trigger or the user actually depressing the trigger. Now, Remington claims that proper care and maintenance and cleaning and lubrication of that trigger, and there was no problems with it. However, they did settle on lawsuits, and part of that settlement of those lawsuits was to replace the triggers on all millions of Remington 700 rifles free of charge. Now, the trigger on these rifles, which was still the carryover from Mike Walker's design in the Remington 721, also had a couple of other issues. One of which was is that the safety of the rifle had to be placed in the fire position to actually make the bolt operate. So if you had, like, say, a Remington ADL that didn't have a floor plate on the bottom of it, the only way you could unload the rifle was to cycle the action a bunch of times, but you had to do it with the safety off, because the way that the mechanism was designed, if the safety was on, you couldn't actually operate the bolt. And then in 1982, Remington actually redesigned the trigger so that, like on this rifle, the safety on this rifle is on. You could actually physically work the bolt of the action with the safety engaged. The company after 1982 would also uh, do a retrofit or a rework of your pre 1982 triggers. They would charge you $20 if you were to send your rifle in, and it was basically a voluntary, I guess, recall, for lack of a better term, which they charged you for, and they would rework your trigger mechanism to make it so that the bolt would cycle and function with the safety mechanism engaged. Another issue with the Remington 700 trigger was that it had adjusting screws on it. Now, those adjusting screws were intended to be used by the factory technicians who were building the rifles in the factory. Those screws were never intended to be adjustable screws for the end user. So when the factory technicians at Remington got done making adjustments to the trigger, they would go ahead and lacquer over those screws for two reasons. One, so that the screws couldn't back out or self-tighten through the act of firing, and two, to keep the end user or consumer from self-adjusting the triggers themselves, to fiddle with, if you will, the triggers to make them just a little smaller or a little cleaner or a little lighter trigger pull. However, the problem is just like with anything, you get some pretty adventurous DIYers and gunsmiths that very quickly realized that you could pick away and chip away at that lacquer, exposing those screws. The problem was is those factory adjustments were not intended to be changed. And so when you get these home gunsmiths making adjustments and changes to those triggers, that only compounded the problem of the inadvertent firing of these triggers due to lack of maintenance or lack of cleaning and things like that. And even though the triggers were never intended to be user adjusted, a lot of owners went ahead and they made them user adjusted. So what I always tell people when they're looking at buying a Remington 700 used is to make sure that that lacquer is still put in place. If it's been chipped away, do one of two things: walk away from the rifle and don't buy it, or two, just plan on replacing it. Put a Timney trigger or some kind of aftermarket trigger in it, because they've obviously fiddled with and futzed with that trigger, and it could be far more dangerous than it was intended to be. Then in 2006, Remington introduced a trigger called the X Mark Pro trigger, which rumored has it had its own myriad of issues and problems, although I've been really unable to substantiate any of those claims. And then in 2009, they came out with a trigger called the X Mark Pro adjustable. And that trigger was used in Remington 700s until 2023. Then in June of 2023, Rem Arms, who was the company that was building Remington 700s at that time, stopped producing trigger mechanisms in-house altogether and just started using Timney triggers as OEM triggers in the Remington 700 rifles. So one place that the Remington 700 rifle actually found a very solid home in was with the military and law enforcement in sniping applications. Since the inception of the military sniper, the military has used everything from modified and repurposed issue rifles like the M1903 Springfield and the M1 Garand, and they even use the M250 caliber or heavy machine gun as a sniping platform. And they would also just use commercially off-the-shelf purchased firearms with a telescopic sight added to them because they were so inherently accurate. Then in the late 60s, the military actually started looking for a very purpose-built sniping system, and they fell on the Remington 700. For the U.S. Marine Corps in 1966, it was the M40, which, for lack of a better description, was basically a heavy-barreled commercial off-the-shelf Remington 700, had a wooden stock on it and a telescopic sight added to it. And in 1988, for the U.S. Army, it was the M24, which was a packaged and sold in a box, basically, Remington heavy-barreled 700 that the Army used for its standard sniper rifle. Now, the biggest difference between the U.S. Marine Corps M40 and the U.S. Army's M24 was that the M40, particularly the rifles that were designated M40A2 and after, were actually built by the U.S. Marine Corps themselves in their own gunsmiths at the Precision Rifle Center in Quantico, Virginia, whereas the M24, which is the rifle that the Army was using, was built, packaged, boxed up, and handed to the Army in a box by Remington. The Remington 700 basically vaulted the military sniping program into the 21st century, and it's still being used today, although it's heavily modernized. They're using skeletonized chassis systems, and for the most part, the only thing that's really Remington on them, as I understand, is the core, action, and bolt. Everything else is built by the military from the action on up. But what we have to remember here is that the Remington 700 was actually created so that Remington could compete with Winchester and the Model 70 bolt action. And the Remington was really ultimately going to become Remington's flagship bolt action rifle, and it certainly has become that. And it has sold over 7 million rifles and has become actually their second highest selling firearm by the Remington company, only beaten out by the Remington 870 shotgun. Despite the controversy surrounding the Remington 700, it still remains one of the finest and most accurate rifle platforms ever made. It's been used for everything from hunting to precision long-range shooting and competition to military and law enforcement sniping spaces all over the world. Now, because of its ease of manufacturing and simplicity of design, the Remington 700 has been copied and used by several other rifle manufacturers for years, and independent gunsmiths who've got a lot of skill with machine tools have also been using the Remington 700 action and design for years, because it does just simply become the core of a very accurate rifle. I personally believe that the 700 design will continue to be used for many, many years to come, and I actually admire it for what it is, despite all of its controversy. It's a simple, effective, and highly regarded and highly accurate firearm. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and wrap this video up. Now, as always, if you're liking these kind of videos and you like what I'm doing out here on the Jack of All Trades channel, please take the time to go down and hit that like and subscribe button. Make sure you ring that notification bell so you get notified of upcoming videos. And then let me know in those comments. The only way I know if you like these kind of videos is if you comment and let me know in those comments. And if you continue to like these videos, I'll continue to do more of them. I want to take just a minute to say thank you to all of my longtime subscribers, the thousands of people who watch these videos. I couldn't make this channel without you guys. I couldn't keep this channel going without you guys and your support, and I really do sincerely appreciate it. With that, this is Ed from Jack of All Trades. As always, thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you on the next video.